Hello everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of videos focusing on analysing classic catalogues by classic artists. Like many others, I enjoy watching top 10 or worst to best artist countdowns by a wide variety of YouTube and internet reviewers. It's always noticeable how common it is for reviewers, I guess quite understandably, to preface their countdowns with a purely personal preference disclaimer and suggesting that viewers can finally present their own versions rather than complaining in the comments section. So that got me thinking as to how big a challenge it would be to try and bring an objective view to a wholly subjective art form, using data to turn art into science, and essentially trying to make the subjective objective. So how do I make it objective? Well, one analogy might be for any of you that have studied at university, where your individual course module assessments are subjectively marked by academics, and then subsequently fed through an algorithm to objectively identify your degree classification. So in some ways we could describe this as taking a collection of subjective individual reviews and taking each catalogue through its classification process. We can also see how a form of objectivity naturally starts to emerge through a process of common consensus, which is why aggregated data can be quite interesting and revealing. So each video will focus on an individual artist or band. Today we'll be kicking off with David Bowie. We're going to count down their aggregated top 10, then use data and analysis to see if any objective conclusions can be drawn on the strength, depth and variety of their entire studio catalogue. And once we've analysed artists individually, we can draw the series to a close by conducting comparative analysis of patterns and trends across all the artists featured. So who's eligible? Well, as it says here, only established artists with extensive and well recognised album catalogues need apply. So essentially artists that have reputations that are sufficient to generate a broad range of individual user countdown lists. And this series is not necessarily restricted to the artists that you see here, but these are examples of the kinds of artists that are likely to feature in this series. But it's also a good point really to focus on the reasons why certain artists are not deemed eligible. So because a minimum of 10 studio albums are required to present a top 10 countdown, with 8, at a push 9 albums, I'm sorry, but there's no place for Led Zeppelin. Nor for a band like Queen, who I would argue are primarily defined by their hits rather than their albums, so no entry. And I'm also going to say not for the Beach Boys, who I'm minded to shy away from on the basis that I think it's maybe just a bit too obvious what the #1 album would be. So on that basis, no entry. So although I'm quite comfortable with my position on Led Zeppelin and Queen, I appreciate I'm maybe taking a bit more of a risk with my Beach Boys position, so I am open to persuasion here. So just before we get to the interesting part of the video, I'll just do a quick run through the criteria and methodology for this exercise. So in common with the approach that's generally consistent amongst reviewers, we're looking at studio catalogues only. So that means no live albums, no greatest hits, best ofs, outtakes or side projects. So for example today we're looking at David Bowie, so it will include his studio catalogue but it won't include Tin Machine. I think I might have heard a few hallelujahs there. But what's in? Well, cover albums are included, as are soundtrack albums where the artist has written and recorded the full album. So the analysis is conducted on the basis of a maximum of 20 reviews across YouTube and the internet, which is enough aggregation to establish clear trends. And even though I really enjoy it, it helps to preserve the compiler's sanity as well. So in terms of the scoring system, it's a straightforward descending order of point scoring for top 10 albums, and then aggregated for full discography rankings and data pattern analysis. I think I should just mention at this point a slight caveat that some reviews may not include very recent output from those artists that are still very active. So for example Dylan, Neil Young, Springsteen, which may have a small impact on overall discography rankings, but I'm fairly confident it's not really anything that's going to impact on the overall top 10 placings that we see emerging. So as I've already mentioned, we're going to start with a top 10 countdown and deep data dive into David Bowie's 26 studio album catalogue. Before we start, I'll just take this opportunity to reiterate the objective nature of the exercise, so this is not about my personal opinions, although I am a music fan, so I'm sure the odd insight and opinion will sneak in as we go through. And finally, just before we dive in, just to confirm that this analysis has been compiled from the reviewers listed here. So if you can see your name or pseudonym here, big thank you to you. This countdown and analysis is only possible due to the time you've taken to post individual reviews. Okay, let's do it. Okay, at number 10, with a critic rating of 27%, we have Heroes. With its underlying theme of experimental electronic rock, this is the second of what became known as his Berlin trilogy. It's interesting to note that the title track is Bowie's most streamed track on Spotify. At number 9, with a critic rating of 33%, we have The Man Who Sold the World. So that's Bowie's third album, where he started to develop more of a rock sound that started to lay a template for the years that followed, and one of a number of Bowie albums with an iconic cover sleeve. At number 8, with a critic rating of 35%, we have Black Star. As you all know, it's Bowie's final album and released just 2 days before his death in 2016. It was a critically well received album and has a strong place in here that backs that up. At number 7, with a critic rating of 37%, we have Diamond Dogs, the 1974 album that closes out Bowie's glam era and also got him his big breakthrough in America. Rebel Rebel was the big hit single, and it's interesting to note that Bowie himself handled most of the guitar playing on this album. And at number 6, with a critic rating of 41%, we have Low. As you know, it's the first of Bowie's Berlin trilogy albums. You can hear the clear krautrock influence, but I would say it's not in any way derivative as a result. And despite the highly experimental change of direction, it still doesn't quell Bowie's instincts for the killer hit song in Sound and Vision. At number 5, with a critic rating of 43%, we have Scary Monsters, the 1980 album that contains a number of hit singles, including the legendary Ashes to Ashes. This album brought the curtain down on his collaboration with Tony Visconti, and also on a decade of critically acclaimed output. At number 4, with a critic rating of 44%, we have Aladdin Sane. It's follow-up to Ziggy Stardust, and although quite similar in style and somewhat an extension to the Ziggy persona, I think its high placing here vindicates Bowie's decision to continue with that theme. Jean Genie was the big hit single from this album, and another of his iconic cover sleeves. At number 3, with a critic rating of 53%, we have Station to Station. So this was the album that encapsulates Bowie's Thin White Duke era. And it's also an album that Bowie recorded with his best friend Charlie, which makes this artistic achievement even more impressive given cocaine is generally considered to be a drug that compromises creativity. And one of several hugely influential albums from Bowie. It's a great album. And at number 2, with a critic rating of 65%, we have Hunky Dory. So this is the album where Bowie finally hit his groove and kick-started his run of classic albums throughout the 1970s. And it's subsequently become one of his most influential albums, and In Life on Mars contains one of Bowie's most celebrated songs. And at number 1, with a critic rating of 81%, which by this time will come as no surprise to any of you, it's Ziggy Stardust. So this was his big breakthrough album, and the absolute cornerstone of the glam rock era, and the first clear evidence of his genre-defining capabilities. It's absolutely packed with classic songs, and still clearly highly loved and revered by fans and critics. And in the end, this was a clear winner amongst the reviewers. So that's the David Bowie Top 10 Countdown. So now let's have a deeper dive into the full catalogue data to see what trends and patterns emerge. As part of this, I shall also attempt to nominate individual albums against a few key categories. So you can see here the full data table for Bowie's catalogue, which of course you can pause and pore over if you're thus inclined. But let's take a look at some of the key metrics that can start to shed some insight into the strength and depth of his catalogue. So we can see here that 35% of reviewers rank Ziggy Stardust as the #1 album. So that's quite a strong showing for Ziggy Stardust, especially when we consider the perceived strength of Bowie's catalogue overall. A high value here could be an indicator of relative weakness across the rest of the catalogue, so a low value is the best indicator of catalogue strength. Of course, Bowie is the first artist we're looking at, so at this stage we don't really know whether 35% is a low or a high value. So Bowie has 10 different albums rated as his #1 album across the reviewers, which is 38.46% of his studio catalogue. So this is likely to be a strong indicator of not just strength and depth, but also the variety across the catalogue. The higher number here, the better, although it's really the percentage value that provides the relative insight. So looking at the difference in rating between the #1 and #2 albums, so 16%, the difference here between Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory. So that's really quite a clear victory for Ziggy Stardust in the end. However, this is likely to be a less revealing statistic, but one that really just simply reveals the strength of affection for the #1 album of the artist concerned. So we can see here that Aladdin Sane at #4 is the highest placed album without any top spot ranking. So this is the album that's clearly highly regarded without ever fully hitting the sweet spot for the fans. And a high place in here I think could be another indicator of catalogue strength. So again, it'll be interesting to see whether other artists, where the equivalent album sits in their rankings. So Young Americans with 9 nominations has the largest number of placings without reaching the overall top 10. So that's interesting because I guess we would essentially therefore deem this the good but not great award. It's quite well liked, but generally in the lower reaches of the top 10 when it is nominated. So we can see here there's only one album that was nominated by every single reviewer for their within their individual top 10s, and of course that is Ziggy Stardust. So I think here the fewer the albums in this category, the greater the indication of wide appeal across the catalogue. So really 0 is the best score that an artist could make here. So the fact that Bowie's coming in with a value of 1, I think that's a strong start and is another indicator for a strong catalogue. So 54% is the rating spread between the #1 and #10 albums. So this is an indicator of the strength of the top 10 albums against each other. So this is a category where a low percentage spread would indicate strength and depth in the catalogue. And then in a similar vein, we can see a value of 77.5%. So this is the percentage of all available ranking slots occupied by the top 10. So this is, I guess, a category where you can perhaps get a sense of front loading for an artist, where there's a strong clutch of albums at the sort of forefront of their catalogue, but it starts to tail off beyond that. So yeah, it's an indicator of the strength of the top 10 against the rest of the catalogue. So I think we would expect the value here for all artists to be quite high, but the lower the percentage here, the likelihood of another indicator of catalogue strength and depth. And then finally, we can see here that with 5 albums at our 19.23% of his studio catalogue, albums failing to score a single point across any of the reviewers. So all great catalogues have their stinkers, and there's Bowie's. You can see them there, all sitting at equal 22nd in the table here. So again, a low percentage value would be another indicator of catalogue strength. So if you remove a couple of these categories, which I think are quite difficult to compare, or don't have much meaning if you compare them against other artists, so these remaining catalogues are those which start to have more value when they are compared against other artists. So it will be interesting to see the patterns that emerge as we build up our information analysis across a catalogue of artists. So now we're going to look at a trend line for Bowie's discography. So as you can see, and obviously because it's a descending order ranking, we're going to see a trend line for every artist that starts from a high point and tails off to a low point. I think what's interesting here is the way in which the trend line moves downwards. So I think there's probably two ends of the spectrum that we would be looking for here. One is a very even sort of gradual drop down from the top to the bottom, which would indicate potentially good strength and depth in the catalogue's artists, with narrower outcomes between the results of the different albums. And on the other end, we could see with some artists potentially a high point that generates quite a precipitous drop and then generates a long tail on the graph, and that would indicate that maybe for a certain artist that there are a clutch of albums that are generally considered maybe far superior to the rest of their output. So these are really the two ends of the sort of trend line spectrum, as it were. And I think what we can see here is that Bowie's looks quite gradual as a trend line. It certainly doesn't have that extreme of the precipitous drop on one end of the spectrum, but at the same time it's maybe not quite at the very even gradual downward trend at the other end of the spectrum. But again, it starts to become more interesting when we see how it compares with other artists. So next we're going to look at the album ratings in chronological order, and I think you'll see a pattern here that's unlikely to surprise any of you watching, but let's just quickly look at or highlight 4 key phases. So firstly, we have that early 70s critical peak with Hunky Dory and then Ziggy Stardust, and then we move later into the 70s and right through to the end of that decade, where still generally critically acclaimed, well regarded albums, very popular with fans and highly influential. Then there's this third phase in the 80s, let's just call it a creative hiatus for Bowie at that point. And then in later years, in the few years I guess leading up to his death, a bit of an uptick in the appraisal of his later output, and starts to become more critically acclaimed. So as I say, I think a trend line that's not really surprising, and what Bowie and fans and aficionados would expect to see. But I think it's worthwhile pointing out that this is by far from the last 80s career nadir that we're going to see emerging through this series of analysis. So next I'm going to use a combination of the data that this exercise has generated and some contextual insight to nominate albums against the three categories that you see here. So we'll start with the most overrated Bowie album. So I'm going to say Young Americans. So this is actually, I think, a pivotal album in his catalogue, and it's received a lot of scrutiny down the years. And it's the first real indication of his ability to effortlessly change style, with this blue-eyed soul sound quite different to what had come before. So this was recorded largely in Philadelphia, and it featured high-profile cameos from John Lennon, Carlos Alomar, Luther Vandross. And it's interesting that the recordings featured the only known meeting between Bowie and Springsteen, with Springsteen being invited to hang out and listen to Bowie's recording of Hard to Be a Sight in the City. So all in all, there's quite a rich history to the making of this album, and of course it's got Fame and Young Americans on it. However, it could only make number 11 on the Aggregator chart, so as a result I think it has to be classed as his most overrated album. So moving on to his most underrated album, I'm going to say that's The Man Who Sold the World. I think this is an album that was largely overlooked for a lot of Bowie's career, and for a long time was categorised in the batch of early albums that were perceived to be false starts in his career, with Hunky Dory being the first album where it started to come together. And I think there may still be some truth in that. It is clearly aged well through the years with Bowie fans, and at number 9 it places higher than some of his more celebrated albums in his catalogue. So for this reason I think it has to be classed as his most underrated album. And then finally onto his most divisive album. So I'm going to nominate Black Star for this category. It's possibly not quite as strong a contender as those placed in the other categories, but I do need to nominate an album, so I am going with Black Star. And it's an album that received a lot of critical acclaim, and although this album sits comfortably in the top 10, at number 8, it actually received the lowest number of nominations across all reviewers, with 11. So this would indicate that it divides opinion to perhaps a slightly larger degree than other albums. This could be due to a general polarising effect of its music, or it could be an indication of some sentimentality creeping into the voting process. After all, it was his final album and it was released just days before his death. Either way, I think there's enough of a data trend here to nominate this in the most divisive category. So that completes my attempt to objectively review David Bowie's studio catalogue. It's early days and with a lot of analysis still to complete, but I think this already looks like quite a strong set of data emerging for his catalogue. Like all art forms, music is highly subjective, so we like what we like, and that's all that matters at the end of the day. But I do hope you found it interesting nonetheless. Let me know in the comment section if you found this to be a worthwhile exercise, or if I should just give it up already. On the basis that I do continue, up next is rock music's poet laureate himself, Bob Dylan. I hope you can join me for the deep data dive into his mammoth catalogue. Until then, thanks very much for watching.